Hello and welcome back to Second Breakfast and our ongoing Game of Thrones coverage, bringing you the best thoughts, theories, and literary analysis this side of Miri Mazdur's shadow boxing square dancing tent.
Square dancing. I'm not gonna lie, your hello there, that threw me.
I'm sorry.
I don't think you've opened on a hello ever. I really liked it though.
Episode 478 felt like the right time to greet people.
Yeah, I think this is the spot. This, one of the final chapters of a book that came out 25 years ago. 30 years, a long time ago. Anyway, welcome back. This chapter was so good. I'm so excited to talk about it. Are you excited?
We're really hitting a fever pitch now. We're
talking...
Yes.
Sorry, that's really funny.
Starring Jimmy Fallon and Drew Barrymore. So this is Dany chapter 8. We're hitting a crescendo. Khal Drogo's taking a while to die.
Sure.
And we finally got some magic going on. We've got Miri Mazdur in full force. I'm going to talk about a Macbeth theory. Maggie's got some stuff about Jon Snow and Dany's baby. But before we get into that, Maggie, what happened in this episode? Spoilers for the books and the show.
I'll tell you what happened in this chapter. This is Daenerys number 8. And so as you sort of hinted at, Khal Drogo is not doing very well. They are writing. His wound is causing some problems, and he is experiencing fever, exhaustion. He's kind of losing it. And on their ride, they're all on their horses as usual, he falls off his horse. And that is really, really bad. If a Khal can't ride his horse, he can't rule. And so they're trying, Dany's doing her best to hide this fact and take care of him and be like, oh, I'm pregnant. We had to stop, So it's not very good. So they make camp, and Dany asks someone to go and fetch Miri Mazdur because she's the one who's been trying to heal Drogo. And while she's waiting, she brings Jorah into the tent that's been, set up for her and Drogo, and they take off Drogo's bandage. It's like a mud cake thing that they stuck on top of it.
Rub some dirt in it.
Yeah, and they take it off, and it looks bad. It is full corruption. It says corruption in the book, but I meant to say infection. It's full on infection. It was interesting is that I actually misremembered this. I think we had both misremembered that this situation that causes his wound to fester and to get infected, it's not because of Miri Mazdur. Miri Mazdur gave Drogo a different thing to put on top of it, but
poultice.
But it was burning, and so Drogo took it off, and they got the other healer to make this cooling mud cake thing, which made it feel better for a while, but has caused it to fester. So that's interesting. But Jorah basically knows, okay, he's going to die, in the next day. It's looking bad. And Jorah says, we have to leave. He says, when Drogo dies, there's going to be a struggle, for the throne, basically, and they're going to kill your son. You have to leave now. But Dany doesn't want to throw everything away. She's finally found a place. She finally has a plan to go to Westeros, and so she, kind of stubbornly wants to stay behind. And so Miri Mazdur finally shows up, and Dany begs her to save him. And she says, well, he's kind of beyond my help, unless she does this blood magic that she learned in the Shadowlands. And Dany's like, yep, we got to do it. And she says, it does come with a price, death, but Dany says, we have to do it. And
she doesn't say the death of who.
No, she doesn't. She said not Dany, she's not your death, but she doesn't specify. And Dany doesn't actually ask for more clarification beyond that, which is interesting. She just says, yes, let's do it. And so they end up putting Drogo in a bath. This part is so cool. They bring in Khal Drogo's horse. Miri Mazdur slits the horse's throat. The blood pours into the tub that Drogo was in, and the horse slowly bleeds out and dies. And then she says everybody has to leave the tent, including Dany. So they all leave, and she's like, the dead are going to come into this tent, and it's going to be bad. She starts chanting and doing this stuff, and when Dany looks inside the tent, she can see the silhouettes of other beings, but it was just Miri Mazdur in there. So there's some weird, scary black magic going on. And of course, the people in the Khalasar do not like this. Drogo's blood riders are trying to be like, hey, we can't do blood magic. And so they're trying to go into the tent and stop it, but Dany's men are fighting back. And then there's a duel with Jorah and some of the guys, and it's just total chaos, bloodbath happening, people dying all around. There's a lot of confusion. Meanwhile, also, Dany's starting to go into labor, and so that's also not good, and she's panicking. She gets knocked to the ground at one point.
Jorah takes a couple nasty cuts.
He does.
To his legs and his face.
Yeah.
He loses half an ear.
Yeah, it's really bad. And so everything's kind of going confusing, and Dany, they're saying, okay, Dany's going into labor. We need to find the birthing woman. But we hear that the birthing woman is too afraid to go up to Dany because she thinks Dany's corrupted with this blood magic. And so Dany's servants say, oh, well, Miri Mazdur said she knows the secrets of the birthing bed. Let's go get her. But at this point, Dany's like, nope, never mind. I don't trust this lady anymore. And she's trying to get them to stop.
She can't talk.
Well,
she's kind of in shock. She's thinking that, but she can't say it.
Yes, she's thinking that, but she can't say it. Right. And so there's all this confusion. She's kind of blacking out. And then she basically passes out, and Jorah brings her inside the tent, and that's where the chapter ends.
So much of this chapter reminded me of that Dead Marsh Barrow White sequence of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah,
because it felt so eerie, but it also had this quietly growing momentum and inertia, especially when Drogo is in the bath, and it says that it's filled up with this, his like dark, I think it's described as black blood leaking from this wound, and of course the horse's blood.
Yeah.
It all mingles together and you can just see his face. And that reminded me of that moment in Lord of the Rings where you're seeing these faces. So there's like this, then there's this dancing in the tent with these shadows, and Dany keeps saying she thinks Mirri Maz is not alone in there, but of course she has to be. And so there is this kind of spectral presence, this veil that's getting thinner and thinner between the living and the dead. It's such a whirlwind of a chapter. It's so exciting. I found myself reading quicker than I usually do. And I'm always interested. I'm always invested. I love this world so much. But this is the first time I've found myself almost racing through paragraphs.
Yeah, I felt really immersed in this one. I mean, George's writing is very immersive, but the nature, the way that we're doing this is obviously going really slowly through this book and taking time to analyze and think things through a way that I wouldn't normally when I'm just reading. But this one, I found myself being really sucked in and just fully enjoying the reading process. And I was like, this is a really, really good story and amazing world to be immersed in. I really enjoyed it. But there was also a lot of like rich symbolism and interesting stuff to unpack. Going through this chapter, I had a really hard time figuring out where I wanted to center my discussion. Like the more I thought about it, I was like, I think you can write maybe not a full dissertation, but maybe a master's thesis on this chapter. I feel like there's all this prophecy stuff. There's all this like symbolism and all these references. And I don't know. I feel like there's a lot going on. So I'm sort of focusing my discussion here on sort of two different prongs. So I think the first one I want to go down is thinking about Dany and why she goes into labor here, because we know she's been getting closer to her due date. Like we know that's going to happen, but it seems to sort of come early at this moment. We know, I mean, I think I know scientifically that if you're a woman who you're getting close to your due date, if you're pregnant, and like some sort of traumatic event happens that can kind of set off labor, like something intense and adrenaline fueled. But I was trying to figure out, okay, where exactly does the labor begin in this chapter and why? And what does that mean for Dany and her character and her son? Because we know, having read the book and seen the show, that her son's not going to survive this birth. Like, it's going to be bad. So it's not just, oh, it's time to have my baby now, hooray. Like, there's something else going on. And what does that mean? And why make her have this baby in the first place? So I was trying to kind of track it. And it's like, I think one of the more obvious signs of when she's really started to go into labor, or at least something is going wrong with her birth, is later on in the chapter. But you can kind of track it earlier and earlier. But I want to start with like what feels most obvious. It's when she's watching Jorah duel with Kotho, one of the Blood Riders. And it says that inside Dany's womb, her son kicked wildly. And then some things happen, I think, not Drogo, Jorah takes a hit, and it says Dany felt a sharp pain in her belly and a wetness on her thighs. So that tells me that she's like bleeding. And
or not that her water broke?
Or maybe that her water broke.
That's how I read that.
Yeah, something has gone wrong. Like something is happening.
I don't think she's ever struck.
No, she's not.
In a way that would draw blood.
I see. Well, I mean, if you're like, if something's going wrong and you're miscarrying, you would bleed.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
So that's sort of what I was thinking.
Okay.
But you're right. Maybe her water did break.
It's such like
I don't
a
know.
flurry of arcs and swords that the wounds almost come out of nowhere. Like we don't see Jorah get hit that many times. We just see him bleeding. That's how we learn about it after the fact. That's why I was confused.
I see. Yeah. So, but so like in this moment, you could argue, oh, well, she's afraid. She's watching this person who she cares about and kind of has grown to love in a way. Like she trusts Jorah more than anybody else. And he's been her, her guiding light this whole time. So watching him, get attacked and potentially die could be scaring her. So maybe that's what sets it off. Okay, interesting. But you can trace it even earlier in the chapter. Earlier on, Jorah says that he tells Dany that the Dothraki are going to kill her son. Right? And then it says the child kicked inside her as if he heard. So maybe that's the moment, like this kick. I mean, babies kick inside the womb all the time. It doesn't mean labor is about to start, but there are a lot of instances in this chapter where the child is kicking and there's some movement happening in her womb. So maybe this fear that, her child's going to be taken away or killed by the Dothraki after Drogo dies, like maybe that's what sets it off. But then you can go back even further in the chapter, and it's right after Drogo falls off his horse. It says that heedless of her belly for once, Dany scrambled off her silver and ran to him. So maybe the act of getting off the horse, like in a hurry and without care, might have set something off. But again, it's motivated by fear. She sees Drogo fall off her horse, so that's scary to her. And I think you can trace it even earlier.
Okay.
And near the very beginning of the chapter, it says like for the past few days, Drogo's not been doing well. He's been getting worse. He's not eating. It's looking bad. And it says that Rhaego was restless in her belly, kicking like a stallion. So again, it seems motivated by fear. She's worried about Drogo getting worse. So it's like, no matter where it starts, I don't know if we can really trace it to a specific moment. Again, because a baby kicking isn't a sign that you're about to go into labor early. It just means that the baby is kicking. But there's all these instances where stuff's happening in her womb and things are restless and moving, and it's all motivated by fear. Sorry. And so I think that what I'm wondering here is it that fear can't exist within her? Like maybe it's like this clashing of the fear and the child, and that's what's causing things to go wrong. Because she thinks to herself later in the chapter, she must not be afraid. She was the blood of the dragon. So it's this idea that like being the blood of the dragon and fear cannot coexist at the same time. And we know that Dany's real children are her dragons. We know that later on.
Right.
And like this is not her real child. And so here to me, it kind of feels like this is like this sign that she can't have fear and be blood of the dragon at the same time. So she can't have this son because like the fear sort of mixes with it wrong. It clashes with it. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's kind of a fight or flight thing. And I mean, if you take that literally, I think of flight with the dragons. But I think I'm realizing this as you're talking about it. I know this is Dany and Drogo's kid. But in my head, and this is probably because I know the kid doesn't survive, and like you, I've spent 10 years thinking that Dany's children are her dragons. But I kind of just think of this as Drogo's kid. And I so much of it, like you keep saying the name Rhaego, and I know that's the name of the kid. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later.
Oh, okay.
But she refers to the child so often as the stallion who mounts the world that I think about the kid in equestrian terms.
I see.
And what I thought you were building to there, this kind of explanation, this similarity, is the way the horse reacts, Drogo's horse, when they bring it into the tent.
Oh, yeah.
It's that it smells death because they've uncovered his wound.
Drogo's wound.
All these names are so similar.
I know.
Jorah takes his knife and cuts away all of the mud that's covering up the wound, so then you can smell that infestation. The infection. Thank you. And the horse smells that and rears up and tries to bolt, and its eyes roll back in its head, and its reaction is total fear. So I thought you were going to say, because the first paragraph of the chapter is talking about how these flies, almost like vultures, are gathering around Drogo, who's functionally dead already, that maybe the child who's being described as the stallion in almost horse-like terms is also rearing up inside Dany and trying to bolt and having this fear reaction.
I see.
So it almost induces labor prematurely, trying to run away from the dying Khal Drogo.
I think that's totally fair. And you are right. At the beginning, it talks about the flies, and it says, the flies circled Khal Drogo slowly, their wings buzzing, a low thrum at the edge of hearing that filled Dany with dread. The first line of the chapter tells us that Dany is full of fear, and that's her trying to overcome it. And even near the end of the chapter, when things are getting really bad, Dany thinks to herself, are they all so afraid? And then it says, another pain grasped her, and Dany bit back a scream. It felt as if her son had a knife in each hand, as if he were hacking at her to cut his way out. So it's like that is a response to not only the fear within her, but just the general fear around her.
But I think the fear within her is, what's his name, Rhaego? Because I don't think of Dany with the dragons as being fearful.
Right.
I think of her as being, vindictive and burning down villages and doing whatever she wants to. So it's almost like the fear is concentrated within the baby.
Yeah. And it's not that as though she never experiences fear after her dragons are born. Of course she does. She's a human being. But she does undergo a dramatic change. Because I think you're right about Rhaego sort of embodying fear. Because the other thing is that he's conceived in fear. He's conceived in like abuse, and she's a child, right? And like I think that
she was sold
Exactly.
Right.
And I think that when Rhaego is actually conceived, that's when Dany is getting a bit more comfortable with things, but it is still this like abusive, obviously situation. And so he is born out of fear compared to the dragons who are not conceived or born in fear. It's like, it's triumph. It's blood of the dragon. It's sort of like reclaiming. It's her own thing. It's not connected to Drogo, this thing that she, both fears and loves and, has a really complicated relationship with. Whereas the dragons are just her and her Targaryen self.
I view that kind of baptism of fire when the dragons come to life. I view that as sort of the end of her Dothraki chapter and a rebirth into a new kind of dragon life, a Targaryen life, where she leaves behind a lot of that fear. And I think that is symbolically really there in the end of the book in a way that it really isn't in the show, because her hair being burned off like it is in the book is the same as the Dothraki cutting their hair when they lose.
Yes, absolutely. That's very true.
So that kind of closes that chapter. Not only does she lose the baby, obviously, unfortunately, but also losing her hair. I feel like that's kind of a clean slate, moving on from the Dothraki fear chapter and becoming this Targaryen on the road to what we know she will do by the end of the series.
That's really cool. And so I think it does really make sense for her labor to start here, for the death of Rhaego to start as like her Dothraki self ends, because we know near the very beginning of this chapter, Drogo's as good as dead. Everybody's saying that, even like as we watch this, blood magic unfold. Dany has a bit of hope, but it's more like a last-ditch effort. What do I have to lose? Like, she knows that he's dying. We know that he's dying. So I think, in a sense, Rhaego also knows. And so that's sort of why all this sets in motion at this moment. It's a really interesting thing to have happen all at once.
It'd be really cool if she'd given birth to him and he'd been like a horse.
I was trying to remember. I don't know if I'm like getting mixed up with House of the Dragon stuff. I was like, is he a normal baby when he's born? I want to say he's like scaly or has a tail or something. I can't remember, honestly.
I love that trope. I love it in horror movies. I love it in fantasy.
When the fetus is like a freaky monster.
Yeah, like Rosemary's Baby. Like it's interesting.
It's fascinating.
And it'd be funny if it was a little horse. I don't know.
And I don't think he's a horse, but I truly can't remember. I don't think when they uncover the fetus, I don't think it's a normal baby. I'm pretty sure there's something weird, but I truly can't remember, and I don't want to look at it to
me
find
neither.
out. So I'm excited to remind myself what happens there. But because I don't think, if it is something funny, strange, I don't think we see it in the show. I think it's just like talked about. So maybe that's why I'm having a hard time remembering. It's because I don't have a solid visual in my brain. But oh well.
Well, you said you had 2 prongs, and before you get to the Jon Snow one, I want to add a prong of my own.
All right.
Together, we're almost a fork.
Whoa. A 3-pronged fork. We're a trident, if you will. Amazing.
So I want to jump off and talk about Rhaego for a bit.
Okay.
There was this quote, and I actually have quotes this week. I know that's rare, but there's this one line.
I'm always full of quotes. I got even more to share, so we'll get there.
There's one line that really stuck with me, and I think it kind of unfurls this whole theory.
Okay.
And it's this short line. I think that's where George is most effective for me. And the line is, "That was the way of men."
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm coming to terms with the themes resolving for this book. I feel like they're all we're hitting the home stretch. I know we have a couple chapters left. Ned has to die still, but I feel like we're resolving some of the big ideas already.
Sure.
And I'm not talking about Targaryen checkpoints because I don't think we really need to anymore.
Yeah, I think we're done. I think that's done now.
We kind of blew that up with Jon realizing, us realizing he was kind of a Targaryen, and hey, there are other Targaryens in the world. It's not that simple anymore. But I think the cross-pollination that we talked about in the last Dany discussion is sort of completed here.
Okay. Where
Dany's far-flung storyline, she's all off in the wilderness and away from everyone else in this world except, old Bear Mormont's estranged son. I think her storyline finally hits Stark level Macbeth here.
Okay.
Which is how the whole first sequence of this book, in our discussions, it was all Macbeth there.
Sure, yeah.
Everything with the king coming to visit and someone might die. We were in the throes of Macbeth, to the point that, if you noticed, in all of our Tuesday episodes, we've been talking about Macbeth more and more.
Macbeth is just there.
Every Friday, I'm brought into the Macbeth trenches as we go through this Game of Thrones book.
That's true.
We just did an episode on Challengers last week, and that was full of Macbeth discussion because I think that whole movie is about Macbeth.
Yeah.
But there's that level of saturation within the play in this Dany chapter.
Cool.
It's dancing witches, it's ghosts and shadows and spells being cast.
True.
But underneath that, I think, is the real content of the play. Because I love all of those overt supernatural elements of Macbeth, but I don't really think that's what it's about.
Okay.
I think those are kind of backdrop, that sort of genre flourishes, but I don't think that's what the play is about. I think this chapter, like Macbeth, is about prophecy.
Oh, yeah.
And
there's a lot of it in here.
It's about people trying to change their fates, or coming to believe they can't change their fates, or blaming or looking to other people to think that they have the power to change their fates. But that is the nugget. That's the root of all of these motivations, is about changing fates. And it's not just reversals of fortune. We see people go up and down. Oh, Dany's going to be a Khaleesi. Oh, no, now she's going to be killed. It's about the people who tamper with other people's fates. It's kind of the sins along the way. Obviously, we have Mary Mesder kind of building up in the background. I'm sure she'll have her full villain monologue in the next Dany chapter. But in the play, I always think of the singular moment for these themes being the murder of Banquo and Fleance.
Okay.
And this was in my head because during the Challengers discussion, we realized there wasn't really a Fleance. That really wasn't what they were talking about.
Sure.
So I've had Fleance on the mind. And then here comes this chapter with perfect, almost supernatural timing, because that idea of the murder of Banquo and Fleance, of the competitor, because he's destined to maybe beget kings, that's why he's murdered. That idea is imminent throughout this chapter and teased on almost every page. Because the big revelation, when, I don't know why I keep spacing on his name, Jorah. I keep wanting to say all these other, Drogo, it's all these.
Yeah, they're all, it's hard. Yeah, it's hard.
It's all these kind of J sounds. But Jorah comes in and gives Dany some of this backstory. And we learn these trends throughout history with conquerors and sons and vengeance plays. So I've got this new takeaway about Banquo and Fleance because it does seem to be the meditation underlying this chapter. It's not only that Dany's son, Rhaego, is now Fleance.
Sure.
He is this future possible king, or this man who might grow up to avenge the death or murder of his father, being called Drogo. It's not just that. It's also that Dany is kind of Banquo now. It's that all of Khal Drogo's men, his blood riders, are talked about in terms like Banquo, where we learn from this lore dump from Jorah that almost like some of the Egyptian traditions in the pyramids, some of the blood riders are killed to go off into the afterlife with the Khal when he dies. So we see the motivation sort of shift there. We've got all these Banquos, and we've got this unborn Fleance within Dany's belly. But it's the bit of history that Jorah gives us here. It's not just, hey, this one situation reminds us of these motivations. It's the reminder that this is how it's always been everywhere.
Yes.
So I have this quote to read, but basically we're recasting the Targaryen lineage. They're not just conquerors. Sometimes they're collateral. Here's the line. Dany remembered the story Viserys had told her of what the usurpers' dogs had done to Rhaegar's children. His son had been a babe as well, yet they had ripped him from his mother's breast and dashed his head against a wall. That was the way of men. And I think this is the other shoe dropping. When we talk about kind of the grim, dark perspective or temperament of this world, I think this is what we mean, because as much as people talk about the series being grimdark, they also talk about it being grounded. And I think this chapter is the perfect synthesis of those ideas, because there aren't really any fated or destined rulers. Sometimes people talk about it in the show, but we're not there yet, so we won't do that. There are no plot-armored lifetime appointments in this world.
True.
There are no real saviors. You talk about Mad King Aerys. You talk about Khal Drogo, the stallion who will mount the world, Ned Stark, Robert Baratheon, Robb Stark. they're all just blown away way before their time, before they can complete their narrative arc or what they were fated to do or all of these prophecies. None of it comes to pass, and these guys are just mulched along the way. They're all these fleeting, grasping, from a certain view, usurpers who are ruling by this tenuous force and force of will. So to go back to kind of the parlance of Shakespeare, if Macbeth isn't really about prophecy, but is really about different characters' reactions to prophecy,
Yes,
it's about tracing the witches pop up and talk to Macbeth and Banquo, and that totally screws both of them up. And the rest of the play is tracing the effects of prophecy and how it warps their minds and drives them to madness and murder and all these horrible things. It's the aftershocks of prophecy.
Yes, because if they hadn't heard the prophecy, none of it would have happened. Right.
But what is the legacy of these characters? Because again, I don't think it's about the witches. I don't think it's about these supernatural elements. The legacy of a character like Banquo isn't, oh, that he would beget kings.
Right.
It's that he's murdered by his friend at the mere possibility that his son might be king. In the same way that Macbeth himself is defined by this like fine print loophole. It's not that, he followed the prophecy and he turned out to be a good king. It was this, like, not reading the fine print of the genie wish, and this guy wasn't technically of woman born.
Right.
In the same way you were talking about the fine print that Mary Masder kind of glosses over with, hey, the price of this spell is death. And but who's death? And she doesn't say that.
Yes.
It's the fine print. It's that these people buy into the prophecy that they are fated, and that's when they lose touch. They take their eye off the ball, and they just get mulched along the way. I think the legacy of all these characters, Banquo and Macbeth, they're kind of the same guy. And at the end of the day, they're both brutes. They're both, at the end of the story, self-interested dead men.
Yes.
Like Khal Drogo. That's
Yes.
why he is this kind of shambling corpse who's just something to think about and worry about and stew on through this chapter. He's just like them, under it all, under all of the prophecy, under all of the magic and the dancing witch and the tent, casting the shadows and doing the little puppets. Under all that, these guys are just dead men. And that's where they all end up. Macbeth, Banquo, Duncan, they're no different from each other. They're all the same. And that's where I go back to that line from the beginning. That was the way of men.
Yes. I totally saw where you were going. That's wonderful. Yeah, because when Jorah is telling Dany they're going to take your son, you're right. It's not just, oh, this is this really savage practice of the Dothraki. He's saying it's always been like this, and it will always be like this. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. There's going to be a power struggle. Men don't want there to be competition. Your baby will be killed.
It's
like, it does not matter.
To win. Because she thinks it's possible that someone else could take over the Khalasar and almost keep her around.
Right. Yeah. Well, she's like, well, but my son is Khal Drogo's heir, so of course. And Jorah's like, they're not going to follow a baby. Like it's all going to fall apart. And it's almost as if like Dany, as she's growing up, is sort of learning this reality about the world, which is strange because her whole life has been shaped by, this exact same reality and this trauma and her, this death of her family and being displaced and, being abused by her brother her entire life and then by this other man. And yet she like is only just now understanding it's like this everywhere. And so it's almost as though like this change in her as she, leaves the Dothraki part of herself behind and embraces this new identity as Mother of Dragons. We're not there yet, but as she's getting there, she's sort of learning how to navigate within the world that she's in, like within this reality that Jorah is laying out for her, because she knows she can't really win this game because the game is not set up for a young girl to win. So she's got to figure out a new strategy. It's
not set up for anyone to win because no one wins for long. It's all these temporary coups. That's everyone's reign. That's why I rattled off all those names.
Yes.
They have this, what did I call it? This like tenuous force this grasping, brief, everyone's king of a hill for a minute. But then
Right.
another army rolls along and someone else wants to be on the throne. I mean, we went through Fire and
I
Blood
was gonna
chapter by
say,
chapter on Patreon.
I think this is the lesson we learned from Fire and Blood is you think about, the Targaryens reigned for hundreds of years, from Aegon the Conqueror up to Mad King Aerys, and it was this great time where the Targaryens ruled, and then all of a sudden it was chaotic. But reading Fire and Blood, you're like, it's always
They're
been
hating
a mess.
and killing each other the entire time.
And there's always a struggle for succession. How does succession pass? Can it pass through a woman? Is it about proximity, or is it about maleness? Like what's the deal? Is it about who is like worthy of the throne? Who would make a good ruler? There's constant struggle. Like there are brief periods of peace, but as we keep asking ourselves,
Right.
peace for whom? Right.
But I think,
and it's always, you're right, it's always tenuous. It's okay for a little bit until it's not,
Yeah.
until a new usurper comes along. Because even in that quote you were reading, that's something I sort of was looking at as well, and sort of in a different way, and I'll get to in a second. But when it says like, they're all holding on to his power, and when he dies, the Dothraki, the Khalasar will, crumble from within. And I was thinking, okay, what's the Westeros parallel? Because at first I thought, it's King Aerys. It's when the Targaryen power falls. That's when, Robert Baratheon comes in and the realm starts to fall apart. But then I thought, well, wait a second. Maybe Robert Baratheon is the power that's keeping everybody together. And when he dies, that's when it all falls apart. But that sort of answers the question is it's always like that. Like you're in power until you're not. Like there's no like winning.
No. And there's no consideration for the losing side.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. I feel like in Macbeth, the deference to prophecy and this kind of delicate, remote mysticism, it almost feels as silly and sentimental as Dany thinking, they wouldn't hurt me or my child.
Right.
And I feel like that's sort of the equivalence we're drawing by the end of this chapter. It's like us being scandalized by Macbeth being willing to kill Fleance as well as Macbeth. That's stupid on our part. Like these guys have been telling us who they are, and they're all the same guy. So I want to apply some of that kind of grounded, grimdark, whatever you want to call it, skepticism, this kind of Witcher worldview that we've been talking about of total self-interest. I want to apply that to the way we think about the supernatural.
Yeah. Okay.
Because if all these guys are equal, the one thing that might stand above them is some of these supernatural elements.
I see.
In the same way, the dragons are what ultimately give Dany the power that she's trying to wield in this chapter.
Right.
And she's trying to invoke Drogo's name as sort of the reinforcement, he's the gold standard backing her threats, but we know he's about to die. But very soon he'll be replaced by her dragons.
Sure.
But I want to see how tenuous, how, I don't know, unstable these magical elements are. Are we being too sentimental? Are we giving them too much power? Is it just this kind of law of nature that governs this whole world? Is magic really something separate or above that?
Right. And I think that the answer that I'm sort of finding in this chapter is that it is intertwined, because I think the connection point I found between when Jorah is talking about how the Khalasar will devour itself when Drogo dies, and that reminds me, of course, of the situation in Westeros, like I just said. But for me, like what actually connects those, apart from just like this universal truth of this is the way of men, I think the other uniting piece is Jon Snow. And Jon has this supernatural element to him, as we've been unpacking and discovering every single time we read him or get a whiff of him on the page, right? And so this was fun because Dany is making this connection without really understanding it, because of course she doesn't know that Jon exists. Because Josh, it looks like I wrote Josh. It says Jorah. My handwriting says Josh. Remember when Rhaenyra gave her children fake nicknames, Jace and Luke? Maybe Jorah's nickname is Josh. Okay. Anyway, Jorah says, Drogo's strength was what the Dothraki bowed to, and only that. When he is gone, Jago and Pono and the other cause will fight for his place, and this Khalasar will devour itself. The winner will want no more rivals. And of course, we think about this parallel over in Westeros. Again, is it King Aerys who falls and things fall apart? Is it when King Robert falls and things fall apart? And the whole rest of this story unfolds, and there's a struggle for power, and that's how you get Clash of Kings, right? But here's the other thing. Because Jorah says, the boy will be taken from your breast the moment he is born. He is Drogo's son, and the crones say he will be the stallion who mounts the world. It was prophesied. Better to kill the child than risk his fury when he grows to manhood. We know from everything we've discussed and all of our theories and all of our, breaking things down, we have decided that the stallion who mounts the world is Jon Snow. I think that's a pretty solid interpretation, and I think it works here because then, like you laid out, you read that beautiful quote. Dany remembered what Viserys had told her when the usurper's dogs had done to Rhaegar's children. Remember, Rhaegar is her brother. It says his son had been a babe as well, yet they had ripped him from his mother's breast and dashed his head against a wall. So that actual son of Rhaegar died. But Rhaegar has another son, and his name is Jon Snow, okay?
Or Josh Snow, depending on who you ask.
And Jon Snow is also the stallion who mounts the world. So Dany is recognizing they're going to do this same thing to my son. Now, of course, Jon is not Dany's son. Jon is her niece, or her nephew. But, I mean like her son as in the stallion who mounts the world. This same thing will happen. And it's like proof here that they've already been trying to do this. They tried to do this to Jon, except they didn't know Jon existed, and therefore it didn't happen. And so they missed their chance to do this to Jon. And now he's grown up, and so he's sort of like bypassed and I guess usurped this attempt to kill him as a baby. And so he will, in fact, take the place of Dany's child who will not survive, and he will be the stallion who mounts the world. And so it's this sort of prophecy, supernatural thing you're talking about of it has always happened and it is still happening, but Jon can exist beyond it or in spite of it. He has, again, surpassed that attempt to kill him. And we know that even when people do try to kill him, he will come back and survive. And so it's like further, I don't want to say proof, but further evidence for Jon being this stallion and for Jon being that supernatural thing that goes beyond this is the way of men. Things are always like this and they always will be. And I'm curious, and it's going to be years till we learn this, but I'm curious what the end of Jon's story really will be, because as we talked about in the show, he goes back to the wall and that's it. And maybe that is what happens, I don't know. But maybe also he gets to have this far more supernatural way of being, and maybe he does get to win the throne and keep it in a way that nobody else has. I don't know.
I wish he was a horse.
You wish Jon was a horse. Mm-hmm. Why?
Oh, like BoJack Horseman style, moping around the wall.
Sure, yeah. Like, oh, yeah, right. Yeah. But so I was just like, I liked that sort of Jorah giving this prophecy like you're talking about. But I like that we both sort of, clung on to that statement that he makes about the way of men and what it means. And I like your Macbeth connection. And I was excited to see Jon sort of like pop out here again. And even like Dany makes a reference to how Rhaegar died for the woman he loved. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, Lyanna Stark. Like Dany doesn't know that, but like we do. And that was really cool to see.
Now, important question as we wrap up here. If Jon Snow, and this is a question for you down in the comments as well, or feel free to email us, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com. If Jon Snow was a horse, would Ghost ride on top of him? Would it be a sidecar situation? Would you saddle them together?
Well, that could be fun. That reminds me, actually, I'm glad
How would they travel?
Hang on, really quick. I'm glad you brought up Ghost, because this was a fun thing. I didn't really have a whole thing about this, but I thought it would be fun to look at for a second. Near the end of the chapter, when Dany's looking inside the tent, she sees Miri Mazdur doing her magic. It says, inside the tent, the shapes were dancing, circling the brazier and the bloody bath, dark against the sand silk, and some did not look human. She glimpsed
They're horses.
She glimpsed the shadow of a great wolf and another like a man wreathed in flames.
Okay.
The great wolf, I thought about Ned, who is either, I don't know the timeline here, he's either already dead here or he is basically narratively dead. And then, or maybe it's Robb Stark, maybe it's both, maybe it's House Stark, I don't know. And then the man wreathed in flames, I think could be a Targaryen because of fire. It could be King Aerys, it could be her brother Rhaegar, or maybe it's more like Tywin Lannister, who's been described as like glowing and bright and like full of fire, kind of like, how we saw him in the last Tyrion chapter. I don't know, but I was interested about those two things and didn't know what you had thought about that.
I like that symbolism, but I think I almost like it more because it's a little vague, because it's a little messy and could refer to a bunch of different guys. It kind of reminds me of that thing we talked about, I forget when it was a couple of weeks ago, about the people coming to resemble the sigils of their house.
Yes. Yeah, you talked about like mascots and
because you could point to a bunch of different characters who are representing this kind of avatar, acting in this kind of animalistic way. So yeah, I don't know what to make of the wolf reference,
Sure.
but I like it.
Well, and it reminds me too of that dream that I forget who, there was some big dream early on in like one of the early chapters that we broke down, where like, who are all these different players in this dream? It was one of Bran's first dreams, right? And there were a couple bits in there that were pretty overt and some that were really ambiguous, and I think are going to stay that way forever. And maybe that's what this is too. Who knows? I think it was just nice. I was like, why bring up a wolf? You know?
Yeah. No, to tie it back to my thing, I think the dreams are interesting as almost another form of prophecy.
Of course, yeah.
More like a more tactile form of the supernatural we were talking about during the Macbeth thing.
Mm-hmm.
You're making me think about that moment at the end of season 2 in Karth when Dany's in that tower and she gets that big prophecy moment.
She gets that whole thing. I'm so excited for that. It's going to be fun.
That's an interesting kind of elevation, because she's going from someone who is the collateral damage of prophecies and people trying to change fates to the person who hears it.
True, yeah.
It's an interesting elevation as she's surrounded by dragons and all these other supernatural elements.
Totally. And this whole chapter, I mean, as we've been saying, is full of prophecy and stuff. So I liked just getting a bit of that as well.
But it's also full of all of these hints that Jon Snow might be a horse.
There's also
and I think that's the button that we need to leave the episode on.
I think you might be right.
We all need to keep an eye out. We need to keep 4 cloven hooves. Is that a devil thing, or is the horses?
No, horses don't have cloven hooves. That's like goats and stuff. But
how do you define a cloven hoof?
It's split in the middle. It's cloven.
Aren't they all split in the middle?
No, not at all. Have you ever seen a horse?
No.
I don't think you have.
I've ridden one with you. You were there.
I know, but look at the horseshoes.
And it could have been Jon Snow.
It's just fully... You heard it here first. Cam rode Jon Snow. I think we need to end it there. I think that's as far as we can get.
Cloven hoofs.
Yeah. The horses don't have those. Look it up. I promise
they've got,
you.
Like metal shoes. That's a different thing.
I think that's the whole thing in the Bible, where you can't eat the animal that has a cloven hoof or something.
Okay, but in Bible times...
This feels like that scene in Goodfellas. His paw. His hoof.
To call your bluff, in Bible times, the horses, did they have the metal shoes?
No.
Because maybe they had, they had a lot of sandals in that time. Maybe it was like an open-toed horseshoe, which would appear to the uninformed eye cloven.
No. Do you know what cloven means?
I don't like cloves.
Oh, okay. I think this has got off the rails. I think we've had too much prophecy for one day.
If you want some of that type, maybe the feeblest thoughts to ever eke out of my brain, check out my latest book, Lemon Tarts in Space.
You're really selling it short. It is very sophisticated, everybody.
I've never put more work into a project.
It's true.
Science fiction cancer comedy. It is Monty Python's... Man, I completely spaced
You got it. Ridley Scott's Alien meets Ponty Mython.
Jon Snow's a Horse. Please buy my book. It's available as a novel or an audio drama. And of course, we have bonus episodes over on Patreon. We talked about before the Fire and Blood episodes. We go chapter by chapter through that wonderful book, doing, the real analytical work that you come here for.
There was not a cloven hoof in sight.
We also have a lot of Breakfast Buffet episodes over on Patreon, including one we dropped just last week, which is our Oscar season episode talking about some movies that have been showered in awards lately, including Brady Corbet's The Brutalist. That was fantastic. We get to talk about American tragedies, why American epics are always ultimately American, or ultimately tragedies.
Yes.
We talk about the Bob Dylan biopic, Complete Unknown, and Nickel Boys, which you may not have heard of, but it's this harrowing, amazing first-person period piece drama. So all of those are up in that discussion over on Patreon. Thank you very much for supporting the show, for supporting the book, for supporting the stupid things we say to you twice a week, or sometimes the smart things. And we'll be back here on Tuesday with another brand new episode.